Why do smart people ruin their lives? Why do good parents accidentally pass trauma to their children? Why do we stay in relationships we know are hurting us? Why do people convince themselves they'll never get caught doing something they know is wrong? Why do we sabotage goals that matter deeply to us? These questions have followed me for as long as I can remember, long before I had a psychology degree, long before I understood terms like cognitive dissonance or confirmation bias. I was already trying to answer one question. Why do people do what they do? If you're listening, I'm guessing you've asked yourself that question too. Hi, I'm Liv, and welcome to The Human Pattern. I've been obsessed with understanding human psychology my entire life, not just in the classroom, but in everyday life. I eventually earned a degree in psychology because I wanted answers. But honestly, I think I was studying people long before I ever stepped into a college classroom. I don't think psychology ever became an interest. I think it became the lens through which I see the world. Every conversation, every relationship, every news story, every success, every tragedy. My brain is constantly asking, what happened beneath the surface? What led someone to believe that this was the right decision? What psychological forces were at play? And I think combination, living psychology before studying psychology, is exactly why I needed to start this podcast. Because I've realized something. Human behavior isn't random. It's patterned, messy, complicated, sometimes irrational, but nonetheless, it's patterned. And once you begin recognizing those patterns, you start seeing them everywhere. From the outside, my childhood probably looked pretty ordinary. But like so many families, there was so much happening beneath the surface that nobody else could see. There were complex family dynamics. People I loved struggled with things they didn't always have the words for. Mental health wasn't something that I first encountered in a textbook. It was something that I watched unfold in real life. I watched people cope. I watched people survive. I watched people make decisions that didn't always make sense to me. And without realizing it, I became incredibly observant. Looking back now, I really think that children often become these little psychologists without really knowing it. When life feels unpredictable, you start paying attention to everything: the tone in someone's voice, the expression on their face, how loudly they close the cupboard, whether someone is unusually quiet, or whether someone seems different than they did yesterday. You start to learn to anticipate emotions before they're spoken. You learn to read people because understanding people makes the world feel a little bit safer. I didn't know the word hypervigilance back then. I just knew that I was constantly paying attention. And I think that's where my fascination with the human behavior really began. Not because I wanted to fix people, not because I wanted to diagnose anyone, but because understanding people felt incredibly important. And then high school happened. And suddenly, psychology wasn't just something that I was observing in other people. It became deeply personal. I struggled with an eating disorder. I struggled with obsessive compulsive tendencies. I found myself repeating relationship patterns that I knew were not healthy. I self sabotaged. And here's what's frustrated me more than anything: I could see it, I could recognize the patterns. I understood what was happening and I knew that there was a healthier choice, but I couldn't seem to make myself consistently choose it. That realization completely changed how I thought about psychology. Because if knowledge alone changed behavior, none of us would struggle. We all know that smoking is unhealthy. We know that sleep matters. We know that movement is good for us. We know that scrolling social media until 1 a.m. isn't helping us. We know that we shouldn't text the person who has broken our heart 6 different times. We know that procrastination makes tomorrow harder. And yet, we still do those things. Why? That question fascinated me. Because clearly information itself isn't enough. Something else is happening inside our minds. Our emotions, our memories, our beliefs, our fears. Something is influencing our decisions beyond simply knowing what's right. And that became the question I couldn't stop asking. Why do generally good people struggle so much? Why do intelligent people rationalize these terrible decisions? Why can't we change even when we desperately want to? Why is there such an enormous gap between knowing and doing? Psychology isn't just a degree hanging on my wall. It's woven into how I understand myself and how I understand other people. And honestly, it continues to challenge me every single day. When I was trying to name this podcast, I kept coming back to one word: patterns. Because once you start studying psychology, you realize something incredible. Families have patterns. Relationships have patterns. Anxiety has patterns. Addiction has patterns. Success has patterns. Failure has patterns. Crime has patterns. Leadership has patterns. Even the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are follow patterns. The people change, the situations change, the details change. But underneath, the human mind often works in remarkably similar ways. And I think that's ultimately what fascinates me. Because once you start recognizing those patterns, you stop asking, what's wrong with that person? And instead, you begin asking, what happened that made this make sense to them? Now, let me make one thing clear. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does help us understand it. And understanding is where meaningful conversation begins. So, what exactly are we going to explore here? Honestly, a little bit of everything. Because psychology doesn't just stay inside a therapist's office, it truly shows up everywhere. We will talk about childhood, identity, relationships, addiction, leadership, habits, mental health, true crime, success, failure. We'll talk about the psychology behind major headlines and the psychology behind everyday choices. Because underneath all of these topics, the same human patterns keep appearing. Take true crime, for example. Most people ask, how could someone possibly do that? But the question I'm interested in is different. What happened psychologically that made their actions feel reasonable to them? Because nobody wakes up intending to become the villain in their own story, right? People justify, they rationalize, they convince themselves that they're different. They're the exception. And if we're honest, we all do that. Not with murder, obviously, but just with everyday decisions. We justify spending money that we don't have. We justify staying in unhealthy relationships. We justify avoiding difficult conversations. And we justify habits that we know aren't serving us. The scale changes, but the psychology often doesn't. And I think that that's really, really important. Because understanding these patterns doesn't just help us understand other people. It helps us recognize them in ourselves. Maybe we catch ourselves rationalizing before we make the mistake. And maybe we recognize our own blind spots. Maybe we become just a little bit more self-aware. And honestly, that's what I hope this podcast becomes, a place where we can investigate human behavior, not to judge people, not to excuse people, but to try to understand people. Because understanding almost always comes before change. So, before we jump into fascinating stories and real world cases, I really want to build up a foundation together. Because over the next several episodes, you're going to hear terms like cognitive bias, cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, rationalization, defense mechanisms, and dozens of other psychological concepts. The good news, you do not need a psychology degree. You don't need to memorize definitions. We're going to learn them together. We're going to use them in everyday examples. We're going to connect them to real life. And before long, I think you'll start noticing these ideas everywhere. You might watch the news a little bit differently. You'll understand your relationships differently. You might even catch yourself saying, wait, I'm doing that. And honestly, that's my favorite part of psychology. The moment that it stops being about everyone else and starts becoming a mirror. So before we finish today, I want to leave you with one thought. I'm not here because I have life figured out. I absolutely do not. I'm not here because I think I'm an expert on human behavior or being human. I'm simply here because I'm endlessly curious. I love asking questions and looking beneath the surface. And I genuinely believe that understanding ourselves is one of the most valuable things that we can spend our lives doing. And if there's one thing that I hope this podcast gives you, it's curiosity. Curiosity about the people around you. Curiosity about the stories behind the headlines. Curiosity about the choices that you've made. Because I think the moment that we stop asking, what's wrong with me, and instead ask, why do I do this? Everything begins to change. That's the journey that I hope we can go on together. So, thank you so much for spending this time with me. This is The Human Pattern, and I'm Liv. And I can't wait to dive into our first real psychological concept in the next episode. I will see you then.